I'm Martin Bailey from the Art newspaper, and I'm chairing or moderating this session this afternoon on museums and engagement. And I'd like to introduce the panel that we have here. This is Ketty Gottardo, who's the curator of drawings at the Courtauld Gallery. She's previously worked at the Louvre, the V&A, the Getty, and she's also done a stint at Christie's. Luke Syson in the middle is the director of the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge. Before that, he was in charge of European sculpture and decorative arts at the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. And earlier on in his career, he worked at the British Museum, the V&A, and the National Gallery. So he's got good experience in the UK. And Nicholas Thomas at the end is the director of the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology at Cambridge, and he's a specialist on Pacific cultures. So it so happens, and I think this is by chance, that we have three people from university museums, but we don't want to confine the discussion in that way, so we're talking equally about national museums and regional museums, local museums and university museums. And another curious coincidence is that we have two people from Cambridge, but we don't want that to make the session too Cambridge orientated for those who went to university elsewhere. The title of the session is The Role of Museums in 2020. And of course, that's now barely a month away. It's coming on very quickly. And the key to what we'll be discussing is in the title of the session, which is how museums can better engage with the public. Now, it seems to me that museums in the UK are as popular as ever, and the statistics are that 52% of UK adults visited a museum or several museums last year. And when it comes to national museums, they attracted a total of 50 million visitors a year, which is an impressive figure. But of the 50 million who go to the UK's national museums, around half are tourists and from abroad. And here at the National Gallery, where we are now, the figure is 2/3 tourists. So that proportion may come as a surprise to some of you, but it does raise the question of whether we're getting enough British visitors at UK museums. And one also must consider that DCMS, the government's culture department, is one of the major funders of the national museums, not the university museums. So I think this afternoon we should be considering 2 points. The first is how museums can engage better with the occasional visitor. That's someone who might come to a museum maybe once or twice a year, but doesn't do so frequently. And then the second, more difficult question is how they can engage or entice the half of the population who don't visit museums or who almost never go. Now, sorry for the long introduction, but before we begin our discussion, I just want to ask all three of you a very simple question, which is how many visitors you had last year, rounded to the nearest 10,000, just so we can take in the figures. And crude numbers obviously only tell a very small part of the story, but I think it would be interesting for us to know how many visitors you have. I know your clothes, so I'll, this is the Courtauld. So I'll ask how many visitors you had in the year before you closed.
In the year before. So, to be frank, I don't have it in my head, but I think we were a little bit under 200,000. But if I can open a parenthesis immediately before passing on to Luke, yeah. It was extraordinary to actually answer your question about the fact that only 1/3 of British visitors visit, for example, the National Gallery. When the Courtauld collection was on show at the beginning of this year in Paris at the Louis Vuitton Foundation, we had almost 500,000.
Well, that shows marketing and the power of marketing in Paris.
Yes,
and
but
the fact that venues in Paris can attract that number, and we're sometimes less ambitious in London.
Yes, but also that British visitors will visit an exhibition in Paris, an exhibition abroad. And so it doesn't really, I think, matter if we just think.
No, I'm saying that numbers are very crude, but I just want to get the numbers for the other institutions. We can discuss the reasons later, but just the plain numbers.
So we went down from 400,000 to 380,000.
Yeah. And
About 80,000.
sorry?
About 80,000.
80,000, yes, fine. Fine. Now, I've only got one prepared question for the panel, and I did give this question to them in rather vague terms before, and I've asked them to respond to it in a maximum of 3 minutes, because we want to cover lots of other things as well. But I wonder if I can ask each of the members of the panel to give their preliminary thoughts on how to engage more deeply with the public, focusing on their own institution. So, Ketty, do you want to start?
Yes. So, when I was thinking about the panel today, our possible conversation, and the role of museums in 2020, and especially the institution I work for, which has a very specific collection. It's predominantly European. The objects are predominantly European. And predominantly male-made. We made a calculation, for example, that only 2.6% of the works in our collection are by female artists. And in today, in looking at actuality and how museums move, I think that it will be a challenge for collections such as ours to make it relevant to all levels of society. And so in the future with the new Courtauld, this is something that we will be thinking and trying to reassess and to bring in different voices who, together with its curators and with the museum professionals who work at the Courtauld, we will try, hopefully in the future, to tell different aspects of the stories that we have learned and have been told about collections, as I said, like ours. So it's a long process, sometimes a slow process, but I think we will be looking into this in the future.
Fine, that's very nice. Now, Luke, do you want to go next?
So, I mean, obviously various possible ways of thinking about this. So I want to give two possible ways forward. One which we tried while I was at the Met, quite successfully, I think, and another which I think we're beginning to think about now at the Fitz. So the first, I think, is key, to actually involve audiences rather than to instruct them. That we, by asking questions rather than by actually laying out closed and finished answers, we can actually indicate to people that there aren't necessarily right answers about artifacts and works of art. We can guide people through knowledge, of course, but it should be about equipping people with conversation, to have their own conversations, rather than necessarily expecting them always simply to gratefully sort of suck at the nipple, if I can put it like that, and perhaps I shouldn't. And so then I think, you know, so for example, at the Met, we did a show, I did it with Eleanor Alcorn, now at the head of Decorative Arts in Chicago, called Plain or Fancy. And what we did was ask people to think about those two words and how they might apply to different objects and how they then played out in their own tastes. Did they like them or didn't they? And actually even making decisions as simple as that. Do you like this object or do you not, and why? Brings people into thinking about something in a different way. We don't have to like everything in a museum, and curators, I think, sometimes are sort of persuade themselves that everything is of equal importance, everything should be loved equally by all of our visitors. But actually that's not true. And by making choices of what you want to look at and what you respond to, that's a key thing. I think the other thing is to remember that most works of art, most objects of material culture, speak to intensely serious but also very widespread concerns. They document faith or love or violence or sex or death, or any of these things that we can, I think all of us do and have to experience. And yet I think art history can sometimes be too self-contained. This altarpiece refers to this altarpiece rather than the serious intent of the artists and makers concerned is really addressed, and that we analyze what they were trying to say about these crucial issues, which are still germane now, which are still important now. And that might actually be, of course, a gender issue. It could be a range of other things. So I think expressing points of view, and sometimes even controversial points of view, at moments when this world is becoming incredibly complicated, and that we look at our objects as having explored those key life themes, if I can put it like that, over generations, over centuries, is a way of making sure that people feel connected, that their experiences are the context may be different, but teasing out those sorts of meanings seems to me to be absolutely crucial.
Thank you. And Nicholas, what would you like to say?
So it's obvious that museums are institutions and buildings and collections, but I think also in a very deep and profound sense they're networks of relationships. And collections also are made up of relationships. There's a tendency to say literally that there's a million objects. It's a little bit like saying that this country is made up of 65 million people, when we know that nations are made up of all sorts of complex social and political forms like citizenship and treaties and questions of what they're part of and not part of, and they're profoundly contested narratives always. It's a far-fetched analogy, but I think in the same sense as collections are made up of these relationships and contested narratives. Since we're in the National Gallery, it's also relevant to remember that when Turner started thinking of the Turner bequest, he started to buy back works that he had earlier sold to various other people, which tells us that collections are above all about human intentions. They're the outcomes of human intentions, but they're also devices through which we can tell stories about human intention, about makers, collections, transactions, arguments, interpretive arguments. In Cambridge, at the Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, we have the incredible responsibility, privilege of caring for what's essentially the first systematically documented ethnographic collection from any part of the world, made by Captain James Cook on his first voyage around the world. It was initially given by him to his Admiralty patron, Lord Sandwich, and it entered the Wren Library at Trinity College, which was actually a sort of quasi-museum until it was transferred to the institution I work at now, not long after its foundation in the early 20th century. And this collection is constituted out of all sorts of extraordinary relationships. In many ways, for a long time, it was a latent collection, but it's been an extraordinarily fertile one, particularly in recent years. And I think one of my biggest mistakes, actually, as a scholar and curator was publishing it, because once we produced this rather beautiful book called Artifacts of Encounter, we were deluged with people who wanted to study material, to borrow it for exhibitions, in some cases to make repatriation claims. These artifacts have had all sorts of extraordinary lives. Things were borrowed in the 1930s for an exhibition of primitive art, mounted by the Burlington Fine Arts Club. Some of them came back to the same part of town for Oceania at the Royal Academy just a year or so ago. What's most extraordinary, and is my sort of roundabout answer to the question, is that material is now going back through a series of staged and extended loans to the places in the Pacific that it came from, in New Zealand, in Tahiti, in Vanuatu, over the next few years. When material went back to Vanuatu, it wasn't just a standard thing with courier crates going into the museum. The artifacts were taken first to the local meeting house. People performed with objects, they handled objects, they treated them in a way as departed ancestors who'd returned and who had come back to life. Yeah. What I think the challenge for us is, in a way, is to make that kind of extraordinary encounter accessible to our audiences in the UK, because our experience has been that Cambridge visitors from the region, Cambridge students are intensely interested in the lives that these artefacts have now.
Fine. Thank you very much. I've just got some follow-up questions for the panel. I wanted to ask Ketty about the reopening of the Courtauld, which I believe is spring 2021. Is that right?
Exactly.
Still, yeah. And how will it be different for visitors? I mean, obviously the rooms will be refurbished, and I believe there's going to be some extra space. But will the experience be similar to what it is now, but enhanced, or have you got any sort of major changes in the way things are going to be presented? And I'm also asking the question in the context of you're trying to presumably get a larger audience and a more diverse audience than you have now, and how is this going to contribute? Sorry?
Those are very different things, to interrupt.
Yeah.
That a larger audience isn't necessarily always the desirable thing. It's actually necessarily, a wider demographic and a more diverse audience.
Well, I'm glad you said that, and I wasn't meaning they were exactly the same, but anyway, what are your plans for the Courtauld?
Well, one of the things that the Courtauld really needed to tackle and to solve was to give really 100% accessibility to the whole building. Because we are housed in a magnificent neoclassical building, but with some accessibility problems. And so that was really one of the major concerns that we had in mind, and that we are going to hopefully solve, not only for the gallery itself, but also the Institute and the Conservation Institute. And it will also add a few small but few new galleries, one of which will give us the possibility to actually display and to talk about hidden areas of the collection, especially photographic one, which very few people have access in years, only scholars and students. And these are photographs of the Whit and the Conway Library, but especially of the Conway Library, which have been recently in the course of being digitized, and have allowed us to bring in a much more diverse array of people that I never encountered the Courtauld. And these have been volunteers who for the past 2 years and for the next year will continue to come in and to actually work on the collection. And there will be therefore a special project when we reopen, when we are going to not only show this collection, but also to give voice to these people who have been in contact with the collection and with the Courtauld, and to give voice to their experience. And not only, and of course we will, our aim is to enhance the visitor experience, but because of the huge public program that we have, the Courtauld has been working with schools in recent years, and especially during our closure, trying to reach all schools in London and outside London that have very little knowledge or contact with art. And that for us as an institution has been really important through the years, but especially I think in this time and age, because institutions like ours have a little bit the responsibility that schools, very little art history is taught in school nowadays, and we know what big problem that is, and how to bring art to all these students who are not taught or can be brought to institutions or museums by their teachers. And so the Courtauld has worked a lot to bring actually art to schools.
Yes,
and
fine. And then I wanted to ask Luke. Luke's been at the Fitzwilliam since February, so he's presumably had just about enough time to decide what direction he's going to steer the museum. and I wonder what changes he has in mind, and specifically changes which might impact on the key question we're discussing this afternoon about engagement.
So I don't think that it's very sensible generally for a director to come in and declare change. I think it's more, it's unwise, not just because it's sometimes arrogant, but also because it doesn't build properly on the kinds of tradition that an institution has enshrined over a period of time. So I think the best policy, and this was something that was brilliantly done by Neil McGregor here and then at the British Museum, is to think hard about what the founding mission of an institution is and then work out from there. When Viscount Fitzwilliam made the bequest in 1816 of the core group of works and the money to house them, he talked about for the benefit of learning, to support learning as an activity which was key. And I think what we need to do now is think what that means. And I know you didn't want us to focus just on the sort of university context, but the university context is fundamental. If we're not going to do something different in Cambridge that actually makes people do that extraordinary thing of getting onto a train for an hour and coming in our direction, then what's the point? Because we don't want to, I think, necessarily just do a sort of mini version of what the London Nationals are doing. We want to be able to use the resource that we have in the city, in the university, in the region, to think about that in a particular way. So I suppose the shift, maybe, if there is a slight one, is to really think hard about how our public engagement role, our public benefit role, and our long tradition of pioneering research, instead of necessarily sort of facing in two different directions, can be going like that and be made to coming in the same direction. So there's a direct line between the kinds of questions we ask of the objects in a completely scholarly sense, involving as many academics from Cambridge University as we can from a whole range of disciplines, and then over here what the public themselves, how they become involved in the conversations that develop around those things. And I think that's the key. So we already, I'm pleased to say, because you inherit projects, I was lucky enough to be in post when Vicky Avery's project worked with Melissa Calarezo and the History Department, opened this week, of Feast and Fast. It's a show about food and its representation. It's a show that demonstrates that things like veganism or anxieties about the labor that was used to produce food go back to the 16th or 17th or 18th centuries, and that and so as a result, although there's a foreignness about some of what we're seeing, there's also a wonderful and sort of glamorous familiarity in a way.
Thank you very much. And Nicholas, I was interested in what you were saying about contested narratives, and you have the, well, I would describe it as a challenge. You may not see it like that, but the challenge in your museum is now there's increasing concern about how certain ethnographic material was acquired and the circumstances, and also in some cases restitution claims, and a quite important feeling that there should be much more engagement with the communities from where that material came. And your museum and other ethnographic museums are doing much, much more than was done 10 years ago. To what extent do you see it as a challenge? And you've got to engage not only with the UK visitors, but you've got to engage much more widely with other far-flung communities who have very different ways of viewing culture. Is this a major issue in your mind, and how is it going to evolve in the next few years?
I think it's not so much an issue, but an area of opportunity and an extraordinary space of discovery, in a sense. I think one thing I'd want to signal is that there's a deeper history to this sort of engagement, and issues that are very high on the agenda for mainstream museums have been over the last decade about public engagement and collaboration and co-production and so on, really started being talked about intensively in the ethnographic museum context in the 80s, especially in institutions in Australia, New Zealand, parts of Canada, South Africa and so on, where curators and collections were sort of right there with the people whose ancestors had produced material, and very understandably people were sort of saying, well, what are you doing for us, and so on. And of course, that process of engagement involved acrimony at certain times, and contest and misunderstanding. But I think in fits and starts, it's advanced in a really fundamentally positive way, partly so that we have a new set of ideas about scholarship. I mean, we would take it for granted now that members of source communities, as they're called in the jargon, are the source of expertise for much material. And very often people from those local communities actually have a very deep scholarly knowledge of relevant archival material. And not so many weeks ago I had an email from someone in Nukuhiva in the Marquesas Islands with various drawings from French archives attached to them that had anomalies that he wanted my opinion about and so on. So this extraordinary sort of fertile space of interaction. And it's emphatically not just about the future destinations of objects. I mean, there certainly are people who very much want material to be returned, and that in itself leads to very rewarding kinds of interactions. I mean, 5 years ago, I would never have anticipated spending time with the Oba of Benin and various other people in Benin City, and I wouldn't have anticipated that some of those same people would eat in my house in North London or spend time with us in Cambridge, nor that contemporary artists from that area would be involved in projects with the museum. So the unpredictability of it and what it brings is extraordinarily positive.
Yeah. Do you have a comment on that?
Well, I'm struck by the form of interaction and this word co-production that is now used quite regularly, and I think it scares curators a little. Long time ago, I was working here, and we campaigned, as many of you will remember, to keep Raphael's Madonna of the Pinks in Britain. It's actually now in Germany, I've discovered. But anyway, but for the moment, it's based here. And as part of the case that we made, we talked about how this particular picture appealed beyond the fact that it was by Raphael to a demographic that of people who had children. I mean, quite simple. It was not a young women with children, and there was a lot of kind of sort of teasing. I remember a lot of teasing going on at that time about what was the National Gallery up to, and where we simply box ticking for the HLF and so on and so forth. And the answer was absolutely not. First of all, the work that we did was fitted within our learning program. But for me, as a curator, it was absolutely revelatory, because it meant that I was meeting people who were, as it were, our consumers, our audience, our visitors, in a different way from the way that I ever had up till that point. And sorry, to cut a very long story short, I remember an extraordinary session where a group of young mothers were talking to me about the picture, and they said, well, one of them said, well, Jesus, I'm afraid I can't quite remember what the age was, but said, the Jesus must be about 9 months old. And I said, well, how do you know that? And she said, well, because he's just learned how to sit up by himself, and the Virgin is just supporting him with the inside of her wrist. So there's a sort of safety net, but she's giving him that responsibility that comes with a certain... Now, I don't have children. That was a form of expertise, of real expertise that comes from a kind of experience that lots of people have, and that then applied to a masterpiece, and it is a masterpiece by Raphael, for me illuminated it in a completely different way. Another visit from the then Secretary of State, I used the words, what were they, tender and intimate. I thought if I said tender and intimate one more time during the course of that 6 months, I might explode. But anyway, so I was doing the tender and intimate speech, and Estelle Morris said, it is more intimate than the others, isn't it? And she looked around the room where it was, and she said, do you know why I think it is? It's because it doesn't have any red in it. And I thought, wow, that was a completely extraordinary thing. To notice an absence is quite a rare thing. But again, what she was realizing was that, red is that sign, that color that goes bing, bing, bing at people, and not having it meant that the visitor the viewer is drawn into that tiny little picture in a different way. Yeah. So those two encounters with people who were bringing their own form of experience, and it didn't have to be, as it were, I don't know how to describe it, but not ethnographic as such, but real. I mean, then was revelatory in a way that perhaps it shouldn't have been.
I wanted to move on, and if we're thinking about engagement, thinking a bit about technology and the impact of technology, and the most obvious thing, I suppose, nowadays is iPhones and photography. So I'd be interested, and presumably that is going to increase in the next few years, and for many people, for young people in particular, it's the way they engage with art. Now, I wanted to ask of each of you whether photography is allowed in your museums. If it is allowed, what impact you feel it's having on the visitor experience, both for those people who are taking the photos and for other visitors, and how it's going to develop. I should add that obviously photography, where it is allowed, is seen partly as a marketing tool to bring in more visitors, so that's good too. Anyway, perhaps you can begin, Ketty, and tell us whether photography is allowed or not.
Sure. So yes, it is allowed at the Courtauld, and we actually encourage people to take photographs and to share them on social media. I must say, I also do it personally whenever I visit an exhibition or a museum, and I do share images. And I find that very often it's a good way for people with whom I'm connected to let them know about an interesting exhibition or reinstallation of a museum section. And I also know of several people who are artists themselves, even if they are not famous yet, that it's a way for them to then look at these images that themselves they took, and then to create art from that photograph. And that I find really fascinating and a good positive outcome of what these works in museums are there for. So not only for visitors to simply enjoy them when they are in front of them, but also then to create art out of them. And taking a picture yourself is different than looking at an image reproduced in a catalog, in a book. So I'm in total favor.
Right. And what about the Fitz?
The Fitz, we do allow photographs, and we've just, with this exhibition, started allowing photography in our own exhibitions. When I first started there, one of the room attendants ticked me off because I was about to take a photograph of a painting by Nicholson to put on my Instagram account. And I found myself doing that thing which I swore I'd never do, of saying, "Do you know who I am?" And he said yes. So, anyway, yes. So the answer is yes. I think I think taking photographs of objects is an act of selection. I think it's a form of collecting in its own right, and I think as a result, it's a really good thing.
Fine. And what about your museum?
So, the answer is yes, of course. But I think what's interesting is that those sorts of photographs, the way people post, is often very idiosyncratic. What interests me, I think, is that it's a continuation of something that people have done for centuries, which is drawing in museums. And what's interesting about drawing in museums is that it can involve this very deep scrutiny of specific objects, but a scrutiny that can be quite indifferent to curatorial intentions. And that reflects the way people can make museums their own. I mean, they're spaces for their own projects, rather than necessarily places where they go and receive narratives or structures of learning that the institution intends.
Well, that's interesting that all three of you are fairly agreed that it is, in simple terms, a good thing, and it is bound to increase over the next few years. I also wanted to explore other areas of technology and how that can bring in other audiences and be attractive. And Ketty suggested that we might think about the Leonardo Experience, which is here at the National Gallery. And the gallery has tried to do something, well, they certainly have succeeded in doing something that's different, which is presenting Leonardo's A Virgin of the Rocks in a very different and unconventional setting, unconventional for an institution like the National Gallery. And you may not have all seen it, but it's a sort of experience in the basement of the main building. And one of the rooms is mocked up as Leonardo's studio. There's another room that explores shadows and how we see three-dimensional objects. And the final room has the original painting with a sort of, in a stage setting, how it might look as an altarpiece. So it is quite unconventional, and the National Gallery was not absolutely convinced that this is the way to do it, but they thought it was important to start and to try something. So I'd be interested in what Ketty felt about it.
Yes. Well, I found it a very interesting initiative because it brought to the fore what technology has allowed the National Gallery to do, and that is to reveal the underdrawing under the layers of paint, and to make this underdrawing, this discovery, this examination available to everyone, but in a very interesting way. And I particularly liked the room of the studio where one is sort of intrigued by the fact, is this actually a recreation of Leonardo's atelier workshop that I'm sure a lot of people may have initially thought, and then understand that actually it's the painting conservation studio or scientist. And I think that it serves the purpose to make the public aware of how much we can learn from modern technology, and in this I think it's a very successful experience and an example, and also what he allows in the last room, where, as you said, the painting is set within this frame, this altarpiece where it probably once was, which is all a reconstruction, a digital reconstruction. And I'm sure does help the visitor to visualize it better than a small image, as we normally would have seen on a label next to the painting. And hopefully the sort of mystery surrounding this display, I hope, will engage maybe irregular visitors, because they will have learned that it's a different way of looking at a painting. And so I'll be curious to know at the end of the show whether that has been the case for the National Gallery or not.
Yes, well, it would be interesting to see how it does. I went down this afternoon. There weren't all that many visitors, and there is an admission charge, £20 at the weekend, which I suspect will be a bit of a deterrent. I was particularly interested to hear Luke's response, because he was a curator here of the highly successful Leonardo exhibition in 2011, which attracted a record number of visitors with a fantastic but conventional, if you like, display. So,
thank you.
So it could hardly be more different, the Leonardo experience here. And the experience here presents the painting as Leonardo without any questions, whilst some scholars question the attribution and whether it's from the studio or not. So have you had a chance, Luke, to go down and see it? And what do you feel about it?
I haven't, actually. I haven't seen it yet. I will, and I'm looking forward to it. And I think I'd just say two things. One is that we did do exactly what you've just described, a conventional, although I think quite good, exhibition on Leonardo da Vinci back in 2011 and 12.
It was excellent.
And so, thank you very much. And so I think at that point, it's actually sometimes a good idea to do something different. And I've read the reviews, and I think they're snotty and snobbish in the way that the response has been so far. We did at the Met a different experiment, but one where when Tullio Lombardo's Adam was put back on view after several years of restoration, after you probably remember it catastrophically fell to the floor of the Velas Blanco, we did a performance piece for 3 weeks where an actor performed as Adam with a digital monitor and answered questions from visitors and from the public about the whole restoration campaign around a whole range of things. I remember the sort of gasps of disapproval from the more orthodox art community in New York. Why on earth is the Met doing this? It's cheap, it's vulgar, it's awful, and those people didn't like it at all. And I don't think it was perfect, to be honest, but it was very, very interesting. The people who liked it loved it, and therefore what was happening was that people who weren't coming came. And I suppose the only thing, I guess, might be, but we all have to, unfortunately, find our income streams. So, it'd be nice if these things could be provided for nothing, but they can't usually. So it's I think that's when one's being experimental. It's sometimes might be an idea to be brave about that. But I can't criticise a fellow institution for charging a ticket because we're in what the financial situation is. So I don't need to talk about that.
Well, I don't know whether I can expect Nicholas to have, coming from the archaeology and ethnographic world, to have visited the Leonardo Experience.
It's extremely
I haven't seen it yet, but I will.
No, that's absolutely fine. After that high tech, I thought I'd ask a question about something rather more mundane, which is, and it sounds slightly boring, labels, because of course they're very important to know what sort of labels you're doing for what sort of visitors. And some institutions have very long, complicated labels on objects with information that possibly should be on the web and not disturb the casual visitor. And other museums, or galleries, and particularly those that have been refurbished in recent years, sometimes have labels that are too chatty and informal and don't actually tell you what the object is or what date it is, which is important to know. So can you very briefly, each of you, tell me what your label philosophy is and whether your labels are good or whether you're trying to change them? Do you want to start, Ketty?
They're very good, of course.
Well, you got the opportunity to change them because you're refurbishing. So actually, presumably one of the tasks that you've got now is writing labels.
Yes, and we are still, I think, struggling to decide where to go from where we were. Because statistics keep saying that visitors don't read labels. We're always told that they don't read labels, and if they are too long, yes, they will sort of stop at the third line. And despite that, whenever I visit an exhibition myself, I always have to struggle to be on the queue in order to read the label because there's always someone else reading it. So I don't know, honestly, whom to believe. They should not be too long, and for sure ours tend to be around 80 words, not 80 or a maximum of 100. And I like the possibility of experimenting to have the regular label on the wall and then having either an iPhone or some sort of gadget of this sort that will allow the person who wants to know more to have an expanded version of them. But technology is not always there and properly made for that purpose. So we're personally, the Courtauld is still looking into the issue, and we haven't yet made our mind.
Fine. Now, Luke's got an awful lot of objects that he's responsible for, and some have labels that were presumably written decades ago.
So maybe rather than talking about the Fitz, which has as you say, different generations of labelling policy and techniques there. This is a nice opportunity, if I may, to plug the British galleries at the Met, which will be opening at the end of February, which was a major project that I worked on while I was there. We thought about labels a lot, as you can imagine, for those. It's the same opportunity, in a sense, to start afresh. And I'm also a great believer in nicking techniques when I think that they work from other institutions. So we're doing headlines of the kinds of things that start with, you know, what's the key question about this object that we want to plant in people's minds? It was a technique that I saw in the brilliant Fashioned from Nature show at the V&A not very long ago, which told you about what the kind of key issue for that particular piece of costume or whatever it was. And I think that helps a great deal to just allow people to focus a little on what on where they read. I think because part of the problems with labels, especially for less familiar objects, is that you go through quite a lot of words first that you've never encountered before you get to the sort of meat of what it is that the institution wants you to think about in relation to that piece. So two things I would say that then happen within that limited space of time. One is the planting of an idea, and the other is linking that idea to what you can then see, so that the label sends you back to the object. Those would be the two key things that I would be arguing for.
Well, a lot of our labels are very, very problematic and dated, and actually not simply not very physically legible. And one of the many things I'm trying to raise money to do is to improve labelling across the museum. But I think there are two things that are really important. I mean, one is the simple question of the identity of the object, and there are cases where who collected it and how is critically important. The other point is simply that I think we encourage people to ask their own questions and explore their own questions around objects, and we try to present issues that they may want to think through, they may want to take away. Authenticity, history, provenance, whether it's actually a work by an individual artist rather than apparently a craft object, those sorts of issues.
Thanks. And Nicholas wrote an interesting article in the October issue of Apollo, and about museums. And one of the issues he's raised was whether museums should be involved in encouraging change and changing society. And this has become quite an important question for museums and galleries with regard to climate change. And right now in London, at the Royal Academy, there's an exhibition called Eco Visionaries, which deals with that in quite an interesting way. And then there's the Eliasson exhibition at Tate Modern. I mean, the primary purpose of it is not to discuss climate change, but quite a lot of Eliasson's works relate to that or other issues regarding society. So, Nicholas, should museums be involved in encouraging consideration of changes for society, or should they, if you like, stay slightly behind and reflect what is happening?
Well, I think many of them have extraordinarily rich collections from many places and many periods that, in a sense, obliquely speak to issues that are extraordinarily urgent for people, so that historic ethnographic collections are also actually archives of Indigenous environmental understanding. I don't think people go into museums to be told what to think or to be the recipients of some kind of crude virtue signalling. But exhibitions absolutely have to connect with, engage the preoccupations that people have, which, as Luke mentioned it earlier, may be about very fundamental and general issues like faith and power and sex and violence. That's just a very fundamental matter of relevance and salience.
I've just realised that time has crept up, and I'm going to give the speakers 1 minute, but no more, to say anything else of importance which they would have liked to have said, or they feel they want to say. if they don't have anything to say in a minute, that would be absolutely fine. Luke, I think you've got something to say.
So I want to say very clearly and very urgently that absolutely museums must address these issues. We're in a period where some very fundamental principles, it seems to me, are being eroded and attacked. And one of the things in my 1 minute that I want to say, that among many issues, I'm deeply proud of the fact that the Fitzwilliam has been pioneering bridging binary tours and LGBT plus tours, and that as a result of that, we now have images of 2 gay couples, one from the 17th century and now one, Ricketts and Shannon, made incidentally by a woman artist, Kathleen Scott. And those are making the narrative bigger of the history of art and the history of production. But as a gay man, I'm also finding myself in that museum in a way that is explicit and clear. And I think that's important at a moment when rights, as I say, of individuals, of groups, of protected categories are being eroded. And if museums don't take a stance in these dangerous times, then I think we're failing.
Well, that was nice. Ketty, you got to beat that.
Very difficult.
Yeah.
Well, definitely. I mean, the museums are the center there with political institutions, I would say, and we have to make a difference, and we have to voice everyone and be inclusive and representative as much as we can. And then, as I was saying, where we have specific collections, like we all, well, especially in my case or in the case of Nicholas, we have to bridge out in all sorts of ways, and it's our responsibility to do that, to find a way to do it. So, yeah.
Fine. And Nicholas, is there anything more that you'd like to add?
Well, it's just a sequel to those comments, and yes, it's a moment where there's very powerful political debate and political contest. If you listen to it on talk radio, that's always marked by antagonism. I think what's special about museums is that they're places where people can come together and sort of mingle and witness things from many different places in a sort of environment of mutual tolerance and respect. And that's why I think we have something very distinctive to offer and a very distinctive responsibility.
Well, that's very good. That's a good way of ending on that note. Now, I'd like to, I'd obviously like to thank the panel very much. I'd also like to thank the organisers of London Art Week, which runs until Friday. It's a great initiative to spotlight the galleries in Mayfair and St James's, and many have special exhibitions which are on this week, so do visit them. Finally, I'd like to thank the National Gallery very much for their hospitality in hosting this afternoon's session. And if anyone wants to thank them, you might consider donating to their appeal for the Gentileschi painting. It's costing £20 million. They're hoping to raise the money by Christmas, and they're nearly there, but I'm sure contributions would be very much appreciated by the gallery. So thank you very much to everyone.